Hello, it's Steve Smith here again, and thank you very much for listening and watching today in the 20th presentation in this series, and this one's devoted to writing. I remind you of my blog there, FrenchTeacherNet.blogspot.com and InformedLanguageTeacher.com, where you'll find lots of readings and videos and a few podcasts about language teaching. So I've kind of left writing to last, really, having talked a good deal about listening, and I think speaking's featured a lot in the presentations I've done, as has reading. Writing, which always seems to me to be arguably the least important of the four skills, and yet one which is highly valued by syllabus designers, by examination boards and so on. There's something traditional about writing, something that's considered high value, isn't it, when things are written down? So I think tradition partly drives the interest in writing, but there's no doubt that writing is worth teaching, well, for a couple of main reasons, I'd suggest. Firstly, because it supports the other skills in building long-term memory and mental representation of the language. And secondly, because of its real-life use, particularly these days, I suppose, with social media. People do write a lot of messages now, even if they no longer write letters very often. So let's talk about writing. If you think of the stages of writing development, you can look at it in this way, if you like, from the very beginnings, and I'm here talking about the sort of language learners that you might have in mind in high schools, secondary schools, learning a modern language. I mean, they might start off by simply noting down individual words or phrases, doing copywriting. I mean, learning the conventions of the language code, for example. If it be a European language, they need to work out accents, for example, and of course if they're learning some languages, of course there's completely different code to be mastered entirely, which is a far greater challenge. Then usually at a second point for beginners, you begin to manipulate the written language. You can combine bits of language together, you apply pre-learned material, you do gap fill, you do short sentence answers, that kind of thing. So this is very controlled practice in the written mode. And then gradually, as you emerge from that, when students are ready for it, then you can look at more guided writing, what you might term free writing or compositional writing, which is normally guided, where there are templates offered, for example, or notes to work from. And then eventually get to the stage, hopefully, where some students will get to the stage anyway, where they can write freely for compositional purposes, as in exams, for example, or for their own personal purposes. So overall, you could see a development, I think, from the very simplest to the most complex use of writing. In Kavanagh and Upton, 1994, they talked about a three-stage sequence, and you'll see the similarities to what I mentioned in the previous slide there. So to start off with copywriting, note-taking, gap-filling, that sort of simple task. Then gradually working to a model, adapting model texts, and then eventually creating one's own texts. I'll give these references at the end, by the way. Walter Grau, in his book, The Elements of Foreign Language Teaching, came up with 5 of his own guiding principles, and they were not in any particular order actually, but linking the spoken and written word, and the idea that spoken language should precede writing. That's certainly an idea that goes back to the oral approach, or the oral situational approach, that adaptive direct method that developed during the 20th century amongst British language teachers, and it's certainly something that makes sense to me. It kind of matches the natural way with languages, speaking coming before writing, and I'll give you examples in a moment of how that can be applied. So writing as reinforcing the spoken word and helping to fix language in long-term memory. He talks about teaching the alphabet early, using it to explain how words are spelled and getting students to use the alphabet. And he also mentions, from his own experience as a teacher, that you cannot rush beginners. Take time in the early stages of writing. Some children are having difficulty coping with writing in their first language when you get them, let alone coping in a second language. Of course, writing in a second language can help to reinforce their literary skills in the first language. Interestingly, back in the 1990s, Grau was talking about a focus on phonics, which is certainly all the rage at the moment, and phonics, so including reading aloud activities, strongly linking the written word with the spoken word. And he makes the point that, just use a variety of activities, which I think probably is common sense. So what actually happens when a student writes? What's going on? Well, if we're talking about free writing, clearly they must have an idea to begin with, what's often termed a proposition. So an idea, something they want to communicate. They're then going to search for first language words and chunks they need. I'm not talking here about advanced writers who've built up a lot of automatized knowledge and who may be at that stage of kind of thinking in the second language. I'm talking about your average student who is using a lot of working memory and trying to put together in a cumbersome sort of way sentences that are both accurate and communicate meaning. So firstly, they're going to look for L1 words and chunks when needed. Then what they're going to have to do is map those against any second language words and chunks that they already know, that they have in long-term memory. And if they find a good match, well then they can use those second language words and chunks and begin to write ideas down. So if there's a match, it's fine. If there isn't a match, so if there isn't enough of that stuff in long-term memory from what they've learned and from their experience, then they're in the realms of kind of making stuff up as they go along, and experienced teachers will tell you the results of that sort of work when you have to mark it or grade it. So students will resort to kind of translating directly from English into very, very poor second language. So they resort to guessing, or these days, of course, they're more likely to resort to Google Translate or something similar. So if you think this is what's going on in the student's mind when they're trying to put pen to paper or to write something down, what are the implications of this for the teacher? Well, I suppose to start with, clearly, they need to have lots of words and chunks in long-term memory. So any work they've done on vocabulary, lexicogrammar, and grammar will help them when they're writing, quite clearly. I think the second big implication here for me would be that there's no point in rushing students towards free writing or composition writing. Or if you're going to get them to do it, make sure it's highly scaffolded so that they have all the means they need to be able to write correct sentences. So that means A, making sure that they have enough language in long-term memory. So only getting them to write about stuff that you know that they've covered thoroughly and reviewed and learned through lots of chunking and lots of repetition. And secondly, give them some material that they can bring into working memory in the scaffolding. So this is where you're talking about giving them lists of words they might try and work in, lists of chunks, gapped templates, that kind of thing. So I think for young teachers in particular, I would beware of rushing to production, shall we say. That applies both to speaking and to writing. It's true that with writing, students get more time. They can reflect. But I promise you, that doesn't stop them writing nonsense. And I think the trouble is, if you take the approach that, let them write freely, they can make mistakes, it doesn't matter. I think in reality, what that does in a student's mind is make them think that they're not very good at doing this. They know it's a struggle, and it reduces their sense of self-efficacy as a language learner, which we know is so important, and could increase their sense of anxiety as a language learner, given their knowledge that they know they're not working within their capabilities. So we always need to give them success, I would say. So if you like, my own kind of principles would be these. I think in any writing task, scaffold the process heavily. And the amount of scaffolding will depend on the class. Try and anticipate problems where you know from experience that there are certain types of language that will give them problems, whether it's certain words that are hard to spell, certain grammatical problems that we know are hard to master. On the whole, work from the smallest bits, from words to phrases to sentences to paragraphs. So with your beginners, you might start off with simple copywriting, simple copying of words and phrases, gradually building up to copying and adapting sentences, and then writing short paragraphs. So many students, by the end of their first year of learning a second language, ought to be able to write with reasonable accuracy short paragraphs using language they've manipulated previously. And I don't think we would expect them at that stage to be able to be too creative with their written language. I return to that principle of starting with the spoken word, focus on listening and speaking, because I think they're the priorities anyway, and then designing lessons so that the written word reinforces the spoken word, and vice versa. So we're talking here about multi-skill lessons, so that you can reinforce the same language over and over, but through the 4 different skills. Now, I would go for insisting on accuracy as far as possible. Why is that? Well, we don't want to fossilize errors. We don't want them to start badly. I think if they start badly, then there's every chance they will continue badly in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. I think as well we're talking again about that issue of feeling accomplished at doing the task. I think students like being accurate. And if they hand in work that's inaccurate and you feel you've got to give negative feedback on it, that's not going to make them feel good as a language learner. So, even with quite able students, and many of the students I taught over the years were pretty proficient, then I think encourage accuracy, scaffold the work so that they can produce accurate work until they are ready to do things more freely. And here I'd liken it to the learning of any skill, I suppose. So if you're teaching someone a complex skill, what could it be? Teaching someone to play golf, which is really hard, I can promise you, then insist on the little details being right. In golf it would be keeping your head still. It would be making sure your swing is correct, that the arc of your swing is correct. So getting all those details right and then gradually putting them together so that you can perform the task well. So to reinforce my other point earlier, don't rush to free writing. And one other thing here, and this can be a problematic one, where possible, I try, if you can, to make writing a focus of homework more than classwork. Now, I know that's easier said than done. If you're working in a school environment where there's not a strong homework culture, then I think inevitably you're going to do more writing in class. Where there is a strong homework culture and where there's not a culture of cheating, copying and using Google Translate, then I think it's great if you can then do lots of speaking and listening in class, lots of teacher-led work, pair work, masses of communication, and then some writing in class. But if you can get the bulk of it to be done at home, then do so if you can. But I am aware of the issues involved in that and the realities in many contexts. So what sort of things can we do? Well, there's a massive written activities, and I'd perhaps ask you just to scan through some of those that I've listed. The one I've mentioned here, by the way, answering comprehension questions and display questions. When I say display questions, these are those sorts of artificial, contrived questions that I've described in previous presentations, which are part of question-answer technique. So, for example, if you were working with a short text, you could ask questions about the text, which aren't really genuine inquiries about the meaning of the text, but where the questions simply get students to rehearse and manipulate language that was in the text. For many students, that's quite a challenge. If you give them a written question and ask them to do a written answer, that demands quite a bit of processing. You can help it. You can help the task by, for example, giving the starts of the answers or giving a gapped version of the answers. And of course, if you've previously done the same exercise orally in the lesson, then if you then do it immediately in the written form afterwards, you're going to get more chance of success. And my own teaching, I found that was a useful way of thinking about lesson planning. So if I'd done a question-answer sequence based on, let's say, pictures or a short text, then I knew that that could be reinforced by a written equivalent of the same exercise. So lots and lots of things you can do, and if you want to see a longer list, I think I'm going to give you a link in a second actually to FrenchTeacher.net. In the teacher's guide you'll find a list of 50 different writing activities, and perhaps you could think of some more. One way that writing is developed, interestingly, is within the knowledge organizer approach. So just in case you're unfamiliar with this, typically in a knowledge organizer booklet you will get this sort of thing where you see here, in this case it's the French on the left and with a translation on the right. That's to make sure that all the input here is comprehensible to students. It encourages a bilingual approach, if you like, where you're encouraging students to activate both the first language and the second language representation in their minds. But if you work with these booklets in class, as they do in some schools, then clearly you're doing a lot of reading, listening, reading aloud, speaking, and then you can begin to work with these in the written form as well. And typically that would involve quizzing yourself, memorizing sentences, and then writing them down in class. Or it could mean adapting your models and slotting in different words. So in the one I'm pointing to here, last night I watched a film with my brother. You could then slot in other things like last weekend I watched a film with my brother. Last weekend I watched a TV program with my sister, and so on. So you can begin to come up with variations on your initial model and then write down those variations. And once students have become accomplished at manipulating their initial models, then they can move to the point of writing paragraphs, and therefore they can build up sets of pre-learned language which they can then adapt, and which, so the theory goes, eventually has a chance of going into long-term memory and becoming part of their more automatized knowledge. But I won't go into that argument now. It's one that I've discussed in previous presentations. In other words, can that automatization occur? And I think most linguists would say that yes, it can, at least to a degree. So the knowledge organizer approach is worth having a look at, and if you're not familiar with it, just go to my blog and search knowledge organizers. When it comes to marking of written work or grading of written work, by marking I simply mean correcting. Grading I would mean actually putting a grade on of some sort. Rod Ellis, who's written a lot about this sort of stuff, picked out two quotations from him. And essentially, the research is very mixed on the usefulness of correcting written work. And without going into any of the detail on this, I would only suggest that perhaps we overestimate the value of putting corrections on students' work, particularly with younger students. Some research suggests that with more advanced students it has more use, and with more proficient students it might have more use. But we're familiar with the idea of students getting their work back and then not really carefully looking at their corrections. And as I think Dylan William has said, that the kind of most useful sort of formative assessment is when students actually do something with the feedback you give them. So I think if you're going to give them feedback, corrections, then make sure they do something with it. Either do the piece of work again or write sentences involving the problematic structures, whatever it might be. But most teachers probably spend too long marking and grading. And in general, why mark? Why grade at all? Well, apart from the evidence from formative assessment, for example, Dylan William I mentioned then, the clear evidence is that putting a grade on people's work does not improve outcomes at all. In many schools you'll have systems of grading which you have to adhere to, and that's understandable. But the evidence from research is certainly that grading does not help. And my own pet theory on this is that the main reason we mark is to make sure the students did the work in the first place. Because if they know you're going to check their work, and they know that you're going to assess it in some way, even if it's just with comments, they know that you care, and therefore they're going to care themselves, and they will do the work in the first place. So my view is that the key thing is the work they do in the first place. That's far, far more important than the feedback they get from you. But if you have any comments to make on that, do say something in the comments section afterwards on the channel. And of course, do subscribe to the channel if you want to hear of any new uploads that come on to the channel. So I mentioned Google Translate earlier on, and how that is a real problem, isn't it? One little idea I came up with, and I'm sure there are plenty others out there, is something which I call Google Translate betas. And in this case, really, what I've got is a parallel translation. So on this slide, you can see the English version of a simple text, and it's gapped. Then on the next slide, we've got, in this case, it's a French version of the same text translated, but where the gaps are placed in different parts. Now, actually, you could use that, of course, as a pair work activity, paired, gapped translation, sort of information gap task. But my idea here is that you would set it as a written task, and perhaps one to be done at home. And although you could put bits and pieces into Google Translate, it's not an obvious one where you would copy and paste this. They might be able to get somewhere with that, but I think in the end, you just have to put up a really strong front when it comes to Google Translate and make sure that students understand clearly what is acceptable and what isn't. So one or two references here. That was the Rod Ellis article, which is available there. That's open access. That was Walter Grau Berg's book, the Kavanagh and Upton little book, which you can still find. It is out there, I think, on Amazon, even if it's just as used copies. A very cheap little book. And also some of the references I've drawn on here come from my book with Gianfranco Conti, The Language Teacher Toolkit. So there's a reminder of the 50 writing activities which you'll find on FrenchTeacher.net in the teacher's guide, along with lots of other advice. So as always, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that interesting, and do subscribe to the channel. Check out for any new editions coming soon. I'm sure there will be some. Bye for now.